Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you very much to CHERN for the kind invitation. It's a great honor to be here. And when you read out my research focus, I always have to giggle because it sounds more like a shopping bag of things and not like a research focus, but that's the life of a think tanker for you. The other thing that comes with the life of a think tanker is the fact that a 30-minute lecture seems outrageous for me. Even the idea that one could speak for so long on a single subject is in what I'm normally working at seems to be absolutely abnormal. So I have prepared about 25 to 30 minutes for you, but I'm normally used to making my point in 7 minutes. So if I'm a bit shorter than that, please apologize. And I would be happy to discuss with you and exchange views with you and just have this as an open exchange. I think I will start by kind of just putting this in a bit of a perspective. I'm a China scholar, as most of you are. I've been working on the topic for more than a decade now. And as for most of all of you, lots of things have changed. From the highly optimistic days of the mid-2000s, where everything was there was a palpable sense of optimism, opportunity, not only in China research, but also when it comes to policymakers and even European industry, we have come quite a long way. And if we fast forward to 2019 and the logic of the EU-China relationship, then we can only say that everything has shifted so significantly. The new general consensus has since become what I've been terming the holy trinity of China being a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. But even this logic is becoming increasingly questionable. And so just to just set the scene for this, how did we get to this topic of EU-China climate cooperation? What is behind this? It was mostly because in conversations with policymakers over the past year and a half, 2 years, we have often discussed the partner, rival, competitor logic. The economic competition element is super highly obvious for everyone, from solar panels to 5G networks. Everyone understands that we're in a economic competitive situation with China. The systemic rivalry element is playing out increasingly on technology, highly pronounced on human rights, and the questions of the future of globalization. But what is increasingly hard to substantiate is the partnership dimension. So when we were walking around Europe and talking to many policymakers all across the continent, also in the US, we were always asking, what is in that partnership box now? And the answer was stunning, because it was almost immediately and unquestioned climate change. It's true, obviously, that climate change is a global challenge that requires enormous amounts of cooperation and coordination, and that we will need China as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases to reduce its emissions if we want to have at least a shot at reaching the agreed upon goals of limiting the temperature from rising and limiting the effects of global warming. But the way in which this response was given did raise a few questions in my head, at least, and there were a couple of other colleagues that had the same immediate reaction. Is the underlying logic of China as an indispensable partner to tackle climate change, which we apply, is that logic still correct? So this all started then with a conversation with Reinhard Bütikofer, who coined the phrase, China's indispensable, but not a partner for climate change. And so that was the outset of thinking about, okay, what is the sense that we can take from this topic? China is not only the largest emitter, it's also the largest investor in renewable energy, and yet it is also unrivaled in building new coal-fired power plants. So what are we seeing here? What is it that we're observing? So in the end, the default assumption, but we need China on climate change, that still conditions policy choices in other areas, not least because the Communist Party is framing it in this way, needs to not be fully abolished, but at least undertaken, undergo a serious inquiry. So together with these, the brilliant co-authors of mine, Clifford Sung and Jennifer Tolman from ECG, we embarked on trying to bring nuance to the China climate nexus a bit. What is fundamentally needed to curb emissions, in the end, not multilateral rhetoric, but actual reduction in carbon use and the transformation of the industries in Europe, the US, and particularly in China, as the single most important factor in making a meaningful difference. And that's a key point to underline. when countries and actors and policymakers from China or from Europe or the US stress the importance of multilateral cooperation, stress the importance of the COP, stress the importance of dialogue, then none of that contributes to actual emissions reductions. What is actually required is domestic action. And that's where partnership becomes increasingly more difficult. So despite the shifts that we can see in China's approach to climate change about 10 years ago, which was influenced mainly by domestic factors, environmental degradation, climate vulnerability when it comes to droughts and floods, and the kind of thinking about the future of industry, real decisive action was still missing. And a just freshly released report, I think it was released yesterday, shows that when it comes to environmental and climate-related threats, 99 of the cities that are most affected are going to be in Asia, 37 of them in China. So the challenges of climate change for China and for the stability of China are real. The understanding that underlies this, or the kind of the logic that underlies this, has not been one of this is something that China does for the world, but a policy change that is required in its kind of from its own perspective, from a domestic perspective, from a national security perspective, from a long-term development perspective. But that never really took hold in the Chinese discourse over the past 10 years. And then we fast forward a little bit more, and we go to the United Nations General Assembly speech in September 2020. That was a momentous speech, not because it was so eloquently delivered, because Xi Jinping's speeches are not about, as you will kind of know, not about the great rhetoric that is in it, but the substance of it was quite striking, because it wasn't only a huge surprise at that very moment that was very much pandemic related, that was very much focused on sort of what is everyone doing to deal with COVID, to kind of drop a little bomb in the United Nations General Assembly and announce the 2030, before 2030 peak carbon target and the 2060 net zero target when it comes to carbon emissions. This was even a surprise within the Chinese system. We had a number of conversations later on with representatives from Chinese ministries and from kind of the research community, the think tank community around it within China. And they were all saying, hold on, wait a minute, we were not expecting this. And this is going to require quite some scrambling to turn it actually into action. And this is why I think, and that's kind of a hypothesis that I would like to propose to you, is that the United Nations General Assembly speech of 2020 of Xi Jinping can be compared research-wise probably best to the BRI speech 2013 in Kazakhstan, where the system was kind of trying to scramble to readjust to understand that there is now a new highest priority and a new set of policy options that is on the table. And that has become a game changer. In terms of kind of what the BRI means, we have done a lot of work in terms of understanding, trying to categorize, etc. But there's a huge vision attached to it. And we sort of see a similar logic when it comes to the decarbonization agenda that Xi Jinping is now promoting. Therefore, it's not super surprising that it's not fully reflected in the 14th five-year plan yet. But we should be very careful in drawing any linear conclusions from the fact that there are no kind of not the most ambitious targets set yet in the 14th five-year plan. For the 14th five-year plan, the announcement actually came a little too late. A lot of the discussions had already been going on. What we will need to look for is what is the implementation plan over the next 2 years? What is the implementation plan on the regional level? What is the energy plan for the next few years? This is where we will see the actual kind of materialization of these new goals. And the dynamic is there. The kind of the political prioritization changes everything. And in conversations with Chinese bankers and with Chinese business representatives, it becomes very clear that local officials and others, state-owned enterprises, will now rush to not only change the rhetoric, that can happen pretty quickly, but also to slowly change their practices. Companies and industries and brands are coming with their own carbon neutrality targets now, and the benchmarking is already happening. So just as a slight comparison, Apple has done it. They've said we want the net zero supply chain by 2030. That doesn't only have an effect on Apple. This has a huge effect on their supply chain in China as well. If you want to continue to do business with them, you need to go neutral. The same holds true for Chinese tech companies as well. They have also announced kind of net zero targets. They have announced new kind of climate goals for themselves. And with the importance of the tech sector as an energy consumption force from now and in the future, and its rising importance in that, this is a highly critical and highly relevant industry. The dynamic is there. It is emerging. Financial institutions, including the largest state-owned banks, are scrambling for institutions and to find institutions that do environmental data, credit data rating, to tap into that data as they're trying to integrate this into their due diligence processes. This mobilization will continue. There's going to be a number of there's going to be like a degree of referencing to this agenda now to also legitimize other actions. This has a highly catalytic effect. And we will continue to see this two-track approach. The post-COVID recovery is going to remain heavily coal-focused. It is going to require kind of social stability, job security. There's not going to be immediate shifts to that. This is going to be still kind of the pushing of the economy out of the slump of the pandemic is going to happen on the old terms, but not after, but in parallel. All the dynamics on the decarbonization are playing out as well. Some of this will actually seem super haphazard right now. Caixin has reported that in just 3 months of this year, Chinese companies have issued more than $12.3 billion in carbon neutrality bonds and asset-backed securities. So all of this can be used to finance the transition process, but the regulatory system is not up to speed yet. Requirements are not standardized yet with regard to carbon reduction targets. So all of this is kind of just actually being put together while the process is already underway. Massive investments will be needed to not only achieve the ambitious goals when it comes to renewables, but also to revamp, for example, China's electricity grid to actually absorb renewable energies. But in 2020 alone, China more than doubled its construction of new wind and solar power plants from the year earlier. It added roughly 72 gigawatts of wind power over that course of the year, when the global addition of wind power was just over 60 gigawatts in 2019, just to kind of give the scale of what is going on there. The social costs that are going to be kind of attached to the transition that is ongoing are real, but so are the opportunities for the Chinese leadership. China is particularly focused on the economic potential of green technologies. This has been going on for quite some time. We have seen it on batteries, on NEVs, in the solar and in the wind sector. In the sectors that are relatively closed off from international competition and where the state plays a massive role in procurement, an effect that we have recently described as China's protected home market advantage, which is a joint study that we've done with ECFR and Rhodium Group, can have a massive distorting effect with regard to the competitiveness of European companies. So this doesn't go and this doesn't happen without having an effect on us. I think the solar industry is a really good example, and not because it's so well known to all the Germans among us, because it sort of killed the German solar industry, but because there was a fundamental misconception around it. The narrative around it was because Chinese companies were so heavily subsidized, they were able to drive prices to the ground, and because the prices were at the ground, the German companies were not competitive anymore. Where it actually turns out, and an MIT study has shown that it wasn't actually the subsidies that were the biggest problem, but it was the economies of scale that China created in its protected home market that allowed for these massive reductions in prices. So the subsidies only had a fraction of the impact, whereas the ability to scale at home under protected conditions was the one condition that made this development over such a short course of time actually possible. And we're already seeing similar developments in the wind industry. It is highly likely that we could also see a similar development, for example, on carbon capture and sequestration technologies and other areas that require massive state intervention. It is important because it is right now no longer about reform and opening up, but about partial reform, selective opening up, and a lot of closing off and strengthening from the inside. I think it is important for European governments, much more so than for industry representatives, who are kind of quite aware of the developments on the ground, to realize that China is turning towards greater self-reliance, and it will play out in these sectors that are of critical relevance for the industries and the energy of the future. This trend has been, like the inward focused trend has been present for a while, but it has certainly been accelerated over the course of the past few years and particularly in response to the increasing rivalry with the United States and the deliberate reinsertion of risk into the market as a category that is driving businesses now. It's become very clear that the Chinese leadership has a different version of globalization, a different vision for globalization in mind, one with China very much at the center, and one where the role of the Chinese market becomes ever more important, where the internal circulation of the much discussed dual circulation strategy of Xi Jinping is of enormous relevance as it insulates China from the inherent problems and potential disruptions of a globalized economy. Weaponized interdependence becomes a huge issue in international relations. Political instability has become an enormous factor that the Chinese Communist Party is worried about. So dual circulation helps with all of this. It is a political and not necessarily an economic strategy as such, and should not be understood as that. So if we follow this logic, then China's vast home market that it uses, but its vast yet protected home market, becomes an enormous asset for the development of its industrial base within China, and allows it to create international economic players on steroids that will be able to kind of severely challenge competition from Europe or elsewhere outside of China on third markets. In a nutshell, what we call the protected home market advantage is an opportunity for Chinese firms to leverage the vast size of China's market to build scale, amass profit, and improve productivity. At the same time, it is also incredibly helpful to improve technical capabilities, product design, and quality. All that with limited or no pressure from foreign competition. And this is quite relevant. We've discussed this today in a different meeting as well. The competition, the fierce competition among Chinese actors on the ground within this kind of ecosystem of Chinese companies is actually a really, really good factor that helps to actually reinforce this home market advantage, because we have seen a home market advantage before in Japan, we've seen it in Germany, we've seen it in the United States before, but usually the stifling effect this has on economies has been kind of relatively visible after a short period of time. So countries have stepped away from it because it actually hasn't increased their competitiveness. But because of the one factor is the enormous competitiveness within China, that is actually kind of contributing to enhancing this, the competitiveness in general, and the kind of the creativity of the companies, but also because the market is so vast, we're talking about timeframes that are just completely different. So even if China's comparative advantage, the protected home market advantage, could run out in 15 years and could turn kind of negative in 15 years, it might kill entire industries of the West along the way. And that's something to be worried and not to be waited out. This advantage enables some of the firms to enter foreign markets on such a strong financial footing, and then to sell tried and tested more tailored products at highly competitive or below market prices. And this is something that in the green technology, so on Tim, we can discuss maybe later a little bit about 5G and kind of how this affects the telecoms industry, where we can definitely see it. But the conundrum that we see at the moment on green technologies is that we actually want China to be successful. So how do we square that? Do we want to continue with research collaboration and technology transfer? Because that is in the end good for the climate. If through massive scaling, Chinese companies can deliver cheaply to global markets, or do we in Europe want to focus on these technologies and industries as well in kind of a European sovereignty context? So if we think energy of the future, national security, who holds the patents of the future in this sector, holds the keys to kind of these strategic industries. And that becomes an actual kind of moral, philosophical problem for us that we are not really grappling with yet, and how to deal with it. It is fundamentally a real political question to answer. We can definitely say that under these conditions, following a mere cooperation logic is no longer applicable. And that's something that may sound trivial to some of you, but actually in policy circles, the climate space was for a long time now singled out as kind of a nicely compartmentalized area where we can be nice. I even had conversations with some representatives that are now kind of members of the Biden administration that were saying it's going to be the happy place of cooperation. And it's really bad to convey the news that there are no more happy places. that all of the areas within which Europe and China, the US and China are interacting will have all the dimensions of a degree of cooperation, of rivalry, and of competition in themselves. So what does this mean for us? And with this, I'm kind of coming towards a close. We also need a two-track approach when dealing with this. We cannot say we give up on multilateral diplomacy in the climate space. We need that. We continue to need this dimension. We need to push China hard to end coal early, to make clear commitments, and to be very forceful when it comes to kind of the developments that we need to see over the next few years. Because this is the kind of China's having this period nicely figured out, that until 2030 there's still some wiggle room for a lot of the developments that are there. So any pressure that can be applied in that regard is a good thing. We also need to cooperate with China when it comes to standardizing the kind of green finance, when it comes to sustainable finance, what is the kind of loans that we should have, how does a kind of a sustainable development policy look like, what are the standards that we can give out for green finance, for green bonds. These areas are all areas that we can cooperatively discuss, and where there's actually a lot of willingness on the Chinese side to also engage and to be present and to be kind of be a cooperative actor. But on the other hand, we also need an economic and industrial policy that is attuned to the challenges that we are facing. So I think we cannot go black or white on this issue, but need to maintain competitiveness of European industry as well. Otherwise, our entire logic of not becoming dependent on China, the entire idea of enhancing European sovereignty and not autarky or autonomy, but European sovereignty in an increasingly geopolitical context, runs hollow if we cannot sustain industries in these sectors. We see some of that already happening on the EU side. Sensitive ecosystems conversations, batteries, NEVs, hydrogen is one of the topics that is coming up. But we need to pay even greater attention to what this does, from basic research to kind of the later stages of economic cooperation, buy-in into investments into the high-tech sector. How does this all fit together, and how does this particularly play out on green technologies? Just as an anecdote from a recent conversation we had with a company that is investing in, that has designed the creation of energy from photosynthesis and is kind of a tech leader in this area, is a European small startup. And then we've asked them, so are you intending to scale this massively? Oh yes, we definitely are. So where do you look for capital? And he said, well, there's a lot of interest from China. And this is exactly the question that I think we see as in a number of areas where innovation that happens here may then in the end wind up in China, and where we cannot afford this on technologies that are so critical to kind of the dual track of where the EU wants to go, the green transformation and the digital transformation. So I think it kind of sits at the heart of where this conversation is. So what do we need to do? We need to protect and advance Europe's competitiveness and market power, enhance our toolbox that is very measured, but play it clearly also when it comes to green tech. Play offense where we can, multilaterally and plurilaterally. The Green Tech Alliance that was named in the EU's transatlantic agenda as the welcome gift for Biden is a first start for that, an open alliance with the US, but also other players, particularly Japan comes to mind, but also India in this regard. This could even lead as far as joint R&D on a number of these areas that are highly critical for the future of the green transformation. This can even mean joint industrial policy. This has never happened, this has never worked, but the conditions that we are facing now are so different that it might actually be one of the few options left. One thing that Europe can do that is kind of on its own, where it can have a significant effect, is enhance the single market and harmonize standardization and regulation across the EU so that it becomes easier for companies to build scale within the EU. That is a first step that is kind of where most people will start yawning that work on the EU because it's been there so long as a complaint, but in these areas it makes particular sense. And then in the best case scenario here, we will see a magnificent race to the top on green technologies, on decarbonizing all of the major economies, and there will be a great benefactor, and that is going to be the climate. In the worst case, we will see a massive loss of competitiveness in the EU and in the US. And I would like to finish by saying, if going back to that logic, kind of the Kazakhstan speech and the UNGA speech can be seen in kind of a similar light, that if BRI taught us one thing, is that we should take Xi Jinping seriously in the ambition and the transformative power of a vision projected from the top within the Chinese system. So in this case, I would rather take them a bit more seriously than to be sorry in the end and to watch multiple solar industry examples evolve. And with this, I would like to end and hand it back to Tim and be open for all kinds of questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Janka. I think I haven't promised too much when introducing you. I think there was a terrific run